I am Ibrahim Traoré. From a rebellious leader to a follower of Jesus Christ, my wife's tragedy changed everything. I used to be a rebel. I believed that strength, toughness, and power could change everything. I thought that if I was decisive enough, I could force the world to listen. But I was wrong. The day my wife was assassinated, everything inside me collapsed. It was not just a loss. It was the moment I realized the very path I chose had pulled the people I loved into danger. I failed to protect her, and that fault is mine. I once believed I was fighting for my country, but in that moment I was just a broken man, standing before a pain that could never be undone. I was angry. I wanted revenge. I wanted to answer the world with the same cruelty it had given us. But then I encountered Jesus Christ, not in a great miracle, but in the silence. When I had nothing left to hold on to, I realized something. If I continued on the same path, I would only create more widows, more children without parents, just like my own story. And for the first time, I understood that true strength is not control, but the ability to change yourself. From that day on, I was no longer the same man. I still stand here as a president, but more than that, I am a man who has lost, a man who was wrong, and a man trying to begin again. I do not say this to seek sympathy. I say this because it is the truth. Africa has suffered too much, but if we continue to respond with hatred, we will never break free. I once chose the path of anger. It took away the person I loved most. Now, I choose a different path, a harder one, a slower one, but the only path that does not lead to more loss. If you are listening to me, I am not asking you to believe. I am only asking you one thing. When a man has lost everything and still chooses change over revenge, would you be willing to hear what truly happened after that night? There are moments in life that divide everything into two parts, before and after. For me, that moment came on the night of March 14th, 2023. It was exactly 9:17 in the evening. I remember the time not because I checked the clock, but because everything that followed burned itself into my memory with a precision I cannot escape. We had just left a meeting in the center of Ouagadougou. It was one of many meetings, the kind that blur together when your days are filled with decisions, briefings, and constant movement. Nothing about that night felt unusual. Nothing warned me. Nothing told me that within minutes, my life would be split in two. Our convoy moved through Avenue Kwame Nkrumah. The city was quieter than usual. Not silent, but subdued. The kind of night where the air feels heavy, as if something is waiting but not yet revealed. The streets were nearly empty. Streetlights stretched across the road in long, pale lines. I sat beside Aisha. She did not say much. She never needed to. There are people in your life whose presence alone is enough. She was that for me. Calm, steady. A reminder that beyond power, beyond conflict, beyond responsibility, there was still something human worth holding on to. I did not know that I was looking at her for the last time. The first gunshot did not sound like what people imagine. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was sharp, sudden, and confusing. For a fraction of a second, my mind tried to explain it away. A tear, a distant noise, anything but what it truly was. Then came the second shot, and the third. And in that instant, reality forced itself upon us. This was not an accident. This was an attack. Everything accelerated. Voices shouted. The convoy reacted. But time, for me, slowed. I remember turning toward Aisha, not because I understood what was happening, but because instinct tells you to look at the person who matters most when something is wrong. Then came the explosion. A grenade. The sound tore through the night and replaced all thought with pure impact. The vehicle shook. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. And suddenly, the world was no longer something I could control. In less than 3 minutes, there were 12 gunshots, 2 grenades, 1 vehicle destroyed. 3 minutes. That is all it took. 3 minutes to erase everything I thought was stable. 3 minutes to show me how fragile power truly is. The target was me. I understood that immediately. This was not random. This was not chaos. This was intention. But intention does not guarantee outcome. Because the bullets did not take me. They took her. I did not see the exact moment. Not clearly. Trauma does that. It fragments memory. But I remember the weight, the sudden shift, the way her body fell toward me, and then the stillness. I called her name, not as a president, not as a leader, but as a man who did not yet understand what had just happened. There was blood, too much, far too much. He held her, and for the first time in my life, I could not do anything. I had commanded soldiers. I had led operations. I had made decisions that affected thousands. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Power did not matter. Authority did not matter. Nothing I had ever built could change what was happening in my hands. I tried to stop the bleeding. I tried to speak to her. I tried to keep her with me through words that I cannot even remember now. Because when fear becomes that real, language disappears. All that remains is desperation. Her eyes, they were not filled with panic. That is what stays with me. Not fear, not confusion, but something else. Something I did not understand then, and perhaps still do not fully understand now. A quiet, a kind of acceptance that I was not ready to face. I kept telling her to stay, to hold on, as if my voice could anchor her to this world, as if will alone could defy what had already been set in motion. But there are moments where reality does not negotiate, where no matter how much you want to rewrite the outcome, you cannot. And then, she was gone, just like that. No warning, no time, no final conversation that could bring closure. Only silence. A silence that replaced everything. The gunfire faded. The chaos around us continued. But inside me, everything stopped. There is a kind of shock that feels like emptiness. Not numbness, not confusion. Emptiness, as if something essential has been removed, and nothing has replaced it. I held her there, longer than I should have. Longer than anyone expected. Because letting go would mean accepting what had just happened. And I was not ready. I was not ready to be a man who had lost his wife. I was not ready to be a leader who could not protect the person closest to him. I was not ready to face the truth that all my strength had failed at the only moment it truly mattered. That night did not just take Aisha. It took the version of me that believed I was in control. It took the illusion that power could shield the people I loved. It took the certainty I had carried for years and replaced it with something I did not yet understand. Failure, not as a concept, but as a reality I could not escape. And in the hours that followed, as the city continued, as reports were written, as people spoke around me, I did not hear any of it. Because one thought had already begun to take hold. A thought that would soon become the only thing I could focus on. They had taken her, and I was going to make them pay. Not as a leader, not as a president, but as a man who had just lost everything and was not yet ready to understand what that loss was trying to teach him. If you are still listening, then you already know what comes next is not about justice. It is about something far more dangerous. After that night, I was still called president, but that word no longer described who I was. Titles can remain the same, even when the person behind them has completely changed. Inside me, something had shifted. Not gradually, not over time, but instantly. The man who had sat in that convoy, the man who believed in structure, strategy, and controlled force, he was gone. What remained was something else, something harder, something narrower, something that did not think about consequences, only outcomes. I was no longer leading a nation. I was hunting. There is a difference between pursuing justice and pursuing vengeance. At the time, I refused to see that difference. Because vengeance feels justified when pain is fresh. It feels necessary. It feels like the only way to restore balance. I told myself I was honoring her, that I was doing what any man would do, that I could not allow her death to go unanswered. But beneath those justifications, there was a truth I avoided. This was not about justice. This was about my inability to accept what had happened. And so I replaced grief with action. Within hours, the orders were given. Within days, the operations began. Within weeks, it became something else entirely. For 60 days, I did not live as a man. I functioned as a force. We moved through regions that had already known too much conflict. Kaya, Dori, Jibo, places where the line between soldier and civilian had long been blurred, where fear was not an event, but a constant condition. Over 300 soldiers were deployed under my direct command. 17 raids were carried out. Dozens of suspects were captured. Every report, Every lead, every whisper of information was pursued without hesitation. I did not delegate. I did not distance myself. I was present, not always physically, but mentally, constantly. Every operation passed through me. Every decision carried my approval. I wanted to see it. I needed to see it, because I believed that somewhere within all of this, there would be a moment where the balance would be restored, a moment where the loss would feel answered. But that moment never came. Instead, something else began to take hold. Time lost its meaning. Days blurred into nights, nights into early mornings. Sleep became unnecessary, or so I told myself. In truth, I avoided it, because sleep brings silence, and silence brings thought, and thought brings pain. So I stayed in motion. I reduced myself to less than 3 hours of rest each day, not because I was incapable of sleeping, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. I did not pray. I did not reflect. I did not question. All of those require stillness, and stillness would have forced me to face the one thing I was trying to escape, that she was gone, and nothing I did would change that. The men around me followed orders. Some believed in the mission. Some questioned it silently. But none of them saw what I was becoming, because on the surface, everything looked like leadership, decisiveness, speed, relentlessness. These are qualities people praise in leaders, but when they are driven by pain instead of purpose, they become something else. They become dangerous. There were moments, brief ones, where doubt tried to enter. A pause between reports, a look in the eyes of a captured man, a silence after an operation ended. But I pushed it away because doubt weakens momentum, and momentum was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. I remember one night in particular, we had just completed another raid. The details do not matter. They all began to feel the same. What stayed with me was not the operation. It was the aftermath, the quiet, the absence of noise after everything stops. Men moving, equipment being gathered, voices speaking in controlled tones, and in the middle of it, standing still, not thinking about strategy, not analyzing outcomes, but asking a question I refused to fully hear. What am I becoming? I did not answer it. I could not, because answering it honestly would have required me to stop everything, and stopping felt impossible. So I continued, day after day, operation after operation. I told myself I was getting closer, that every action brought me nearer to the people responsible, that soon there would be closure. But closure does not come from force. It does not come from numbers. It does not come from how many operations you conduct or how many people you capture. Closure requires acceptance, and I was not ready for that. Not yet. The truth is, I was not chasing them. I was running from something, from grief, from guilt, from the realization that no matter how much power I held, I could not undo what had already been done. And the more I ran, the more I lost sight of everything else. I was no longer a husband. That role had been taken from me. I was no longer a man capable of reflection. That part of me had been buried beneath anger. And slowly, without realizing it, I was no longer even leading in the way I once believed I did. I was reacting, driven, consumed, and everyone around me was moving within that same momentum. Because leadership does not just guide actions, it shapes direction. And at that time, my direction was simple. Find them, end them, make it mean something. But meaning cannot be forced. And deep down, beneath everything I was doing, there was a truth waiting for me. A truth I had not yet accepted, that no matter what I found, no matter who I captured, no matter how many operations succeeded, she was not coming back. And until I faced that, nothing I did would ever be enough. If you are still listening, then you understand something important. Pain can turn a man into something he never intended to become, not all at once, but step by step, decision by decision, until one day, he no longer recognizes himself. We found them near the border, close to Mali, a place where lines on a map mean less than the reality on the ground, where control is uncertain and loyalty shifts with survival. The intelligence came in fragments. intercepted communications, local reports, movements that did not match patterns. Nothing was perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was enough. Enough for me to believe that this was it. That after 60 days, after every raid, every sleepless night, every decision driven by a single purpose, I had finally reached the end. The camp was not large. Temporary structures, scattered positions, the kind of place built for movement, not permanence. They were not expecting us. That gave us the advantage, and I took it without hesitation. The operation began before dawn. Timing matters. Darkness gives cover. Silence gives surprise. Everything was calculated. Everything was controlled. At least, that is what I believed. The assault lasted 27 minutes. Not longer. Not shorter. 27 minutes where everything I had been building toward unfolded in real time. Gunfire echoed through the camp. Orders were given. Positions were taken. Men moved exactly as they had been trained to. It was efficient, precise, decisive. 17 armed men were killed. No speeches, no declarations, no moment where anything felt like victory. Just an ending. When it was over, the noise disappeared, just like every other operation. But this time, it felt different, because I had told myself that this moment would change something, that when it was done, when they were gone, there would be a shift, a release. Something inside me would finally settle. I walked through the camp, past what remained of the fight, past the bodies, past the signs that this place had once held intention, movement, life. And I waited. I waited for something to happen, for anger to leave, for satisfaction to arrive, for meaning to reveal itself. But nothing came. There was no relief, no sense of justice completed, no feeling that balance had been restored. Only a question, quiet, unavoidable, unanswered. If she does not come back, then what was the point of all this? It did not come as a dramatic realization. It came simply, clearly, without emotion, and that is what made it impossible to ignore. Because for the first time in 60 days, I was not driven by action. I was standing still, looking at the result of everything I had done, and realizing it had changed nothing. The men around me saw success. The mission was completed, the objective achieved. From the outside, it was exactly what had been intended. But inside me, there was only emptiness. The kind that follows when you reach the end of something and discover that it was never going to give you what you thought it would. I had believed that this moment would bring closure, that ending them would somehow honor her, that it would make her loss meaningful. But loss does not become meaningful through destruction. It does not resolve through retaliation. It simply remains. And the more you try to fight it, the more it reveals itself. I stood there longer than I needed to. Not because there was anything left to do, but because I did not know what came next. For 60 days, my path had been clear. Find them. End them. Now that it was done, there was nothing left to chase. And when there is nothing left to chase, you are left with yourself. That is the moment most people avoid. The moment where action no longer protects you from truth, where movement no longer distracts you from reality. And I was not prepared for it. Because without the mission, without the pursuit, without the structure I had built around my pain, there was only one thing left. Grief. Unresolved. Waiting. I did not collapse. I did not react outwardly. That is not how it happens. It is quieter than that. More controlled, but far more dangerous. Because when realization comes without release, it stays. It follows you. It does not leave. I returned from that operation with everything I had set out to achieve. And nothing I actually needed. That is the truth I could no longer avoid. Revenge had not failed because it was incomplete. It had failed because it was never capable of succeeding. And that realization was the beginning of something I did not yet understand. Not peace, not acceptance, but the first crack in the belief that had guided me for so long. That force could fix what had been broken. If you are still listening, then you understand something now. There are battles you can win completely and still lose everything that matters. For the first time in many weeks, I stopped, not because I chose to, but because my body no longer gave me a choice. Exhaustion does not arrive like a warning. It does not ask for permission. It simply takes control when everything else has been pushed too far. After the operation, after returning, after reports were filed and voices moved around me like distant echoes, something inside me shut down. Not emotionally, not mentally, physically. I had been running on something that was not sustainable. Anger can fuel you, but only for a time. Eventually it burns through everything it touches. And when it does, there is nothing left to keep you standing. I remember sitting down just for a moment. That was the intention. To pause, to gather my thoughts, to prepare for whatever came next. But there was no next, not immediately. Because the moment I allowed stillness, everything I had been holding back began to rise. And instead of facing it, my body chose for me. I slept. Not the kind of sleep that brings rest. Not the kind that restores you. This was something else. A collapse. A surrender to exhaustion so complete that I had no control over it. There were no dreams at first. Only darkness. A kind of absence that felt deeper than ordinary sleep. As if my mind had gone somewhere it could not be reached. I do not know how long it lasted. Time, in that state, does not behave normally. It stretches. It disappears. It becomes irrelevant. But at some point, something changed. The darkness was no longer empty. It became something else. Not noise, not confusion, but presence. It is difficult to describe something that does not follow the rules of logic, because the mind tries to interpret it using what it already understands. And this was not something I could easily explain. I was no longer in the place where I had fallen asleep. That much was clear. But I was not fully aware of where I was either. There was no sense of location, no recognizable environment, only a feeling, a stillness that was not empty, but full, a silence that was not absence, but calm. For weeks, my world had been filled with sound, gunfire, voices, movement, constant pressure. Even when it was quiet, it was never truly quiet, because inside me, everything was still moving, still reacting, still resisting. But here, there was none of that. No urgency, no tension, no need to act. And for the first time since that night, I was not being pulled forward by something I could not control. I was simply there, aware, present, without resistance. It did not feel like escape. It did not feel like avoidance. It felt real, more real than the world I had been moving through. And that is what unsettled me. Because when something feels more real than reality itself, you begin to question everything you thought you understood. I did not hear a voice, not in the way people imagine. There were no words at first, only awareness, a sense that I was not alone, but not in a way that created fear, in a way that removed it. That is the part I struggled with later. Fear had been constant in my life, not always visible, not always acknowledged, but always present. It shapes decisions. It drives actions. It defines reactions. And suddenly, it was gone. Not suppressed, not controlled, gone. Replaced by something I had not felt in a very long time. Peace. Not the kind that comes from resolution, but the kind that exists without needing explanation. I did not understand it. I did not question it, because in that moment, there was no reason to. When something removes pain without force, you do not resist it. You allow it, and I did. There was no urgency to leave, no instinct to wake, no part of me trying to return to the world I had left behind. Because for the first time since everything had happened, I was not carrying anything. Not grief, not anger, not guilt. It was all gone. And that absence was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Because if those things were gone, then what was left of me? That question did not come as fear. It came as awareness, a realization that everything I had been holding on to, everything I believed defined me in that moment, was not actually permanent, that it could be removed, that it could disappear. And if it could disappear, then perhaps it had never been as fixed as I thought. I did not yet understand what this meant. I did not yet understand what I was being shown. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not just sleep. This was not just exhaustion. This was something else. Something that did not come from force. Something that did not come from effort, something that did not demand anything from me. It simply was, and I was in it, without resistance, without control, without the need to understand. That would come later, because what followed was not just awareness, it was encounter. And that is where everything I believed began to change. If you are still listening, then you are ready to hear something that cannot be explained through logic alone. What I am about to say is not something I would have believed before that night. Not because I lacked imagination, but because I trusted logic more than anything I could not explain. I had built my life on what could be seen, measured, controlled, on what could be proven, on what could be acted upon. But there are moments when reality presents something that does not ask for your belief. It simply reveals itself, and you are left with only two choices: deny it or face it. In that place, in that stillness, I was no longer resisting. So when it happened, I did not question it. At first, there was only light, not a light that came from a source, not something that illuminated an object. It did not behave like light in the world we understand. It did not cast shadows. It did not change intensity. It simply existed everywhere. And within it, there was presence. I became aware that I was no longer alone. Not in the way you sense someone entering a room, not through sound, not through movement, but through knowing, the kind of knowing that does not come from thought. It comes before thought. And then I saw her, Aisha. She stood in front of me, not as a memory, not as an image created by grief, but as something real, clear, undistorted, whole. There was no wound, no trace of what had happened, no pain, no fear, nothing broken. She looked at me the same way she always had, with calm, with steadiness, with a kind of understanding that I had only begun to grasp after losing her. For a moment, everything else disappeared, not because it vanished, but because nothing else mattered. All the anger, all the pursuit, all the decisions that had consumed me for weeks, they had no place there, because in front of me was the one thing I believed I had lost forever. I wanted to speak, to ask questions, to reach for her, to hold on to something I thought was gone. But before I could, I became aware of something else, someone else, standing beside her. And when my attention shifted, I understood immediately, not through recognition of form, not through familiarity of image, but through presence, a presence that removed fear completely, a presence that did not demand attention, but drew it naturally, a presence that did not overwhelm, but steadied everything. It was Jesus Christ, not as I had seen in paintings, not as I had heard described in words, but as something far beyond representation. There are no accurate comparisons, because anything I say will sound like an attempt to simplify something that cannot be simplified. He did not speak at first. He did not need to, because everything around him was already communicating something I could not ignore. Peace. Not as an idea, not as a concept, but as a reality, a state that existed without effort, without condition, without conflict, and standing there between the woman I had lost and the presence I could not deny, I understood something without being told. This was not a dream. This was not imagination. This was not something created by exhaustion or grief, because nothing I had experienced in the past weeks had prepared me for this. Nothing in my mind had the ability to create something this clear. Aisha looked at me, not with urgency, not with sorrow, but with calm, as if she had already accepted something I was still resisting. And in that moment, I realized something that struck deeper than anything I had faced before. She was not the one suffering. I was. Everything I had done since losing her, every action, every decision, every pursuit, had not been about her. It had been about me, my pain, my anger, my inability to let go of something I could not control. And standing there, I felt that truth more clearly than anything I had allowed myself to feel. I had been trying to fight loss, as if it were an enemy that could be defeated. But loss is not something you defeat. It is something you face. And I had not faced it. I had avoided it, transformed it, used it to justify actions that I believed were necessary. But in that moment, None of those justifications held any weight, because truth does not argue. It simply exists, and when you stand in front of it, you either accept it or you continue to suffer. I did not yet know what I would choose. I did not yet know what was being asked of me, but I knew this. I was no longer in control, and for the first time in my life, that did not feel like weakness. It felt like clarity, because control had not saved me. Control had not protected her. Control had not brought me peace. But here, in this place, without control, there was something I had not felt in a very long time. Stillness, and from that stillness came the moment that changed everything. If you are still listening, then you are ready to hear what she said to me. She looked at me, and for a moment, I could not speak. Not because I had nothing to say, but because everything I had carried for weeks suddenly felt small in her presence. All the anger, all the justification, all the reasons I had built to explain what I was doing, none of them belonged there. Aisha did not rush toward me. She did not cry. She did not ask why. She simply stood, calm, steady, as if she had already moved beyond everything I was still holding on to. And then she spoke. Ibrahim, you don't have to do this anymore. Her voice was exactly as I remembered. Not louder, not softer, but clearer, clear in a way that did not leave space for misunderstanding. And something inside me reacted immediately. Not with peace, not with acceptance, but with resistance. Because what she said went against everything I had been doing, everything I believed I had to do. I felt the words before I spoke them. They rose from a place that had been building since the moment I lost her. They killed you. It was not a question. It was not a statement meant to explain. It was something else. A defense. A justification. A reason. As if saying it out loud would prove that everything I had done was necessary. That I had no choice. That my actions were not driven by anger, but by obligation. And for a moment, I believed it again. Because when pain is that deep, you search for anything that makes it feel justified. But she did not respond with anger. She did not respond with correction. She did not argue. She simply looked at me with the same calm I had seen the moment before. And then she said something that I was not prepared to hear. And you are letting my death destroy you. The words did not come with force. They did not accuse. They did not demand. But they cut through everything I had built around myself. Because they were true. Not in a way I could argue against. Not in a way I could reshape or reinterpret. But in a way that left no room for defense. Everything I had done since losing her had not brought me closer to peace. It had pulled me further away from it. Every operation, every decision, every moment I chose action over reflection had not honored her. It had consumed me, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, not as a thought, but as a reality I could no longer avoid. I wanted to respond, to explain, to justify again, to hold on to the belief that I had been right, but something in me had already begun to break. Because when truth is presented without force, you cannot fight it the same way. There is nothing to push against, nothing to reject, only something to accept or deny. And denial was becoming harder. She stepped closer, not quickly, not urgently, but with intention. And as she did, I realized something I had not allowed myself to feel. I missed her, not as an idea, not as a memory, but as a presence. The absence I had been running from was standing in front of me, whole, calm, untouched by everything that had destroyed me. And that made it harder, because if she was not suffering, then what was I doing? Who was I doing it for? The answer was no longer what I had told myself. I was not doing it for her. I was doing it because I could not accept losing her. And that is not the same thing. She looked at me again, and this time, there was something else in her expression. Not sadness, not disappointment, but something deeper. Understanding, the kind that sees you completely and does not turn away. And then she said the words I had resisted from the very beginning. Forgive them. I felt the reaction immediately. Not thought, not reasoning. Reaction. No. It came from a place that had not yet changed. A place that still believed forgiveness meant weakness. That letting go meant losing. That if I did not hold on to anger, then everything would become meaningless. because anger had become my connection to her, my proof that what happened mattered, my way of refusing to accept that it was over. Forgiveness felt like the opposite of that. It felt like letting go, and I was not ready to let go. They don't deserve it. That was the next thing I said, not calmly, not thoughtfully, but as a defense, because if they did not deserve forgiveness, then I did not have to give it. And if I did not have to give it, then I could continue what I had been doing, continue being who I had become, continue avoiding the one thing I had not yet faced. But she did not respond to my words, not directly, because what I was saying was not new. It was predictable. It was the same reasoning that has driven conflict for generations, the same belief that keeps cycles repeating, that keeps loss creating more loss. Instead, she responded to something deeper, to the place where my words were coming from. If you don't forgive them, you will never be free. That is what she said. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to create a crack. Because for the first time, forgiveness was not presented as something for them. It was presented as something for me. Not to excuse what happened, not to erase it, but to stop allowing it to control everything that followed. And that idea was something I had not allowed myself to consider, because I had believed that holding on to anger was strength, that releasing it would mean losing something important. But what if the opposite was true? What if holding on to it was the very thing keeping me trapped? I did not answer her, not immediately, because this was not something I could resolve with a single response. This was not a decision of action. It was a decision of identity, of who I would be after everything that had happened. And I was not ready, not fully, but for the first time, I was no longer certain. And that uncertainty was the beginning of change. If you are still listening, then you understand something now. The hardest battle is not against others. It is against what you believe you cannot let go of. After she spoke, there was no silence, not the kind I had known before. This was different, not empty, not heavy, but full of something I could not ignore. I did not move. I did not speak, because something was about to happen, and I felt it before I understood it. The presence beside her, Jesus Christ, did not step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not command anything. And yet, everything began to change. Not around me, but within my awareness. The light did not disappear, but it shifted. And suddenly, I was no longer only standing there. I was seeing something else, not with my eyes, but with something deeper. At first, it came as fragments, images, moments, disconnected. But then, they began to form a pattern, a landscape I recognized. Africa, not as a map, not as borders, but as reality, movement, life, and conflict. I saw villages, not in peace, but in fear. Smoke rising where homes had stood, not as symbols, but as consequences. I saw women standing in places where men once stood beside them, now alone, not by choice, not by time, but by violence. Widows, thousands, more than I could count, each one carrying a loss that did not make sense, each one left behind by decisions made far beyond their control. Then I saw children, and this was harder, because children do not understand war the way adults pretend to. They do not justify it. They do not explain it. They only experience it. And what I saw was absence. Children without fathers, without mothers, without protection, without answers, looking at a world that had taken something from them before they even understood what it was. And as I watched, something became clear. This was not one place, not one conflict, not one group. It stretched across regions, across nations, from Mali to Niger to Sudan to Burkina Faso. Different names, different leaders, different justifications, but the same result: loss, repeated over and over again. And then I saw something that I could not turn away from: myself, not standing as I was, not in that place of light, but in the world I had left behind. moving, commanding, deciding, and in every action, I saw the consequence, not the intention, not the strategy, the consequence. Every order, it did not end with the target. It continued, beyond what I had allowed myself to consider, into families, into homes, into lives I had never seen. And in that moment, I understood something I had never fully accepted. I was not separate from this. I was part of it. Not the only cause, not the only force, but part of the cycle. The same cycle I had believed I was fighting against. The same cycle I had justified through purpose. The same cycle that had taken Aisha from me. And suddenly, everything became clear in a way I could not ignore. Violence does not stay where it begins. It spreads. It moves. It multiplies. It does not end when one side wins, because it creates something that continues beyond the moment. Grief. And grief becomes anger. And anger becomes action. And action creates more loss. And the cycle continues. I had believed I was interrupting that cycle, that through strength, through force, through control, I could bring it to an end. But what I saw was the opposite. Every step I had taken had kept it moving, not because I intended it, but because that is what the cycle does. It does not require intention. It only requires participation. And I had been participating, willingly, confidently, believing I was doing what was necessary. And now, I was seeing what it had actually done. There was no voice explaining this to me, no words guiding me through it, because none were needed. The truth does not require explanation. It requires recognition. And I could no longer deny what I was seeing. I was not only a leader trying to protect my people, I was also a man whose actions had contributed to the very suffering I claimed to oppose. That realization did not come with shame, not in the way people think. It came with clarity, a clarity that removed excuses, that removed distance, that removed the illusion that I was separate from the outcome. And standing there, I felt something shift inside me again. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to understand that what I had been doing could not continue the same way. Because if it did, then nothing would change. Not truly, not beyond the surface. The presence beside me did not force this realization, did not demand it. It simply allowed me to see. And once you see, you cannot return to not knowing. That is the burden of truth. It does not leave you unchanged. It asks something of you. And I began to understand what was being asked, not in words, but in direction. If I continued the path I had been on, then I would create more of what I had just seen. More widows, more children without parents, more men like me, standing over loss they could not undo. But if I chose something different, something I had once considered weakness, something I had avoided, then perhaps the cycle could begin to slow, not end immediately, not disappear, but change. And change is where everything begins. I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, only something to decide. And that decision was no longer about strategy. It was about who I would become next. If you are still listening, then you understand this. Sometimes the hardest truth is not that the world is broken, but that we are part of why it remains that way. I woke up at 4:12 in the morning. There was no gradual return, no slow awareness. One moment, I was there. The next, I was back. In the same room, in the same body, in the same world I had left behind. But nothing felt the same. My clothes were damp with sweat. My breathing was uneven. My heart was moving faster than it should have. Not from fear, not exactly, but from something I had not felt in a long time. Awareness, clear, sharp, impossible to ignore. For a few seconds, I did not move, because movement would have meant accepting that I was no longer in that place, that the stillness, the presence, the clarity was no longer surrounding me in the same way, and I was not ready to lose that. Not yet, but reality does not wait. It does not pause for understanding. It simply continues. So I sat up, slowly, not because I was weak, but because everything inside me had changed, and I needed to understand how to exist within it. The room was quiet, not the kind of silence I had experienced before. This was different. It did not feel empty. It felt still, as if something from that place had followed me back, not physically, but within me. And for the first time since that night, since the convoy, the gunfire, the loss, I noticed something. My mind was not racing. There were no immediate plans. No next operation forming. No target. No urgency to act. Only one question. Simple. Unavoidable. If I continue this, how many more will die like her? It did not come from guilt. It did not come from fear. It came from clarity. A clarity I had not allowed before. Because before, I had been focused on what had already happened, on what had been taken from me, on what needed to be answered. But now, my attention had shifted forward to consequence, to what would happen if I did not change. That is what was different. Before, I acted because of the past. Now, I was thinking because of the future, and that changed everything. I stood up, walked across the room. Each step felt deliberate, not forced, not hesitant, but aware, as if I was moving for the first time without something pushing me. There was no anger, not gone completely, but no longer in control, no longer the force behind every decision. It was there, but it was no longer leading. And that alone was something I had not experienced since losing her. I tried to return to what I had been doing, to the structure, to the momentum, to the path that had defined the last 60 days. But something stopped me, not physically, not externally, internally, because now I could see it clearly, what that path led to, not just in theory, not just in possibility, but in reality. I had seen it. I had felt it. I had understood it in a way that could not be undone. And once you see the outcome of your actions clearly, continuing blindly becomes impossible. That is the moment where choice becomes real, not before, not when you are reacting, not when you are driven, but when you understand and still have the ability to decide. And I was there, standing between two directions, the one I knew and the one I did not. The known path was easier, familiar, structured. It required no uncertainty. Continue the operations, maintain pressure, respond with force. It was what people expected. It was what I had been doing. It was what I knew how to control. The other path was different, unclear, uncertain. It required something I had avoided for a long time. Restraint, reflection, patience. Things that do not produce immediate results. Things that are often mistaken for weakness. And I understood immediately why I had never chosen it before. Because it does not give you the satisfaction of action. It does not create visible outcomes quickly. It forces you to accept that change takes time and that not everything can be controlled. But now, after everything I had seen, after everything I had done, after everything I had lost, I could not return to the first path without knowing exactly where it would lead. More of the same, more loss, more cycles repeating, more people standing where I had stood, holding something they could not save. And that was no longer something I could ignore. I walked to the window, looked out at a city that had not stopped. Because the world does not stop when you change. It continues. People move. Decisions are made. Life unfolds, whether you are ready or not. And I realized something in that moment. Change does not begin when the world is ready. It begins when you are, and I was not ready before. But now, I could no longer say that, because I had seen too much, understood too much, felt too much, to continue pretending that the path I had chosen was the only one available. It was not. It never was. I had simply refused to see the alternative. But now, I could, and that meant something had to change. Not everything at once. Not in a way that would erase what had already happened, but in direction, in intention, in choice. And that is where everything truly begins. Not in action, but in decision. The decision to stop repeating what you now understand is broken. The decision to move towards something uncertain, because the certainty you once trusted has already failed. I did not announce it. I did not declare it. Not yet. Because real change does not begin with words. It begins quietly, internally. It begins quietly, internally, where no one else can see it, but where everything is shaped. And in that moment, at 4:12 in the morning, I made a decision, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, to begin moving in a different direction. If you are still listening, then you understand something important. The moment of change is not loud. It is quiet. It happens when no one is watching, but it determines everything that follows. When a decision is made in silence, the world does not immediately recognize it. Nothing changes at first. The same people speak, the same systems move, the same expectations remain. And that is where the real test begins. Because it is one thing to see clearly when you are alone, and something entirely different to act on that clarity when others are watching. By June of that year, I could no longer keep the decision within me. Not because I wanted to explain it, but because leadership does not exist in isolation. What I chose would affect everything around me. And so I began, not with a speech, not with a declaration, but with action. The first decision was the most difficult, to reduce retaliatory operations, not to stop defending, not to abandon responsibility, but to stop responding with force as the immediate answer to every act. It went against everything I had practiced, everything I had believed, everything others expected from me, because strength, in the eyes of many, is measured by how quickly and how decisively you strike back. And I was choosing something else, something slower, something less visible, something that would not immediately be understood. Then came the second decision, to open dialogue, not with everyone, not blindly, but with local groups, communities that had been caught in the middle for too long, people who had lived within the cycle, not as participants by choice, but as those who endured its consequences. This was not negotiation in the traditional sense. It was listening. And listening is something power often avoids, because it requires you to accept that you do not control the entire truth. The third decision followed, to invest in humanitarian support, not as an afterthought, not as a response to damage, but as a priority. Food, shelter, stability, basic things that are often ignored when focus is placed only on conflict. These decisions did not come with immediate results. They did not produce visible success. They did not create moments that could be celebrated. And that is what made them difficult. Because people do not trust what they cannot see, and they question what they do not understand. The reactions came quickly, not from enemies, but from those closest to me, allies, advisors, military leaders, people who had stood beside me through everything. They did not see what I had seen. They did not feel what I had felt. And so, from their perspective, this change did not make sense. Some called it hesitation. Others called it weakness. A few said it directly. You are giving them space. You are slowing momentum. You are risking everything we have built. And I understood why they said it. Because before, I would have agreed with them. Before, I would have seen this shift as dangerous, as unnecessary, as a step backward. But now, I could not return to that thinking, because I had seen where it led. I had lived it. I had followed it completely, and reached the end of it. And the end had given me nothing. That is what they did not understand. They were still in the middle of the path, still believing that if they continued, it would eventually lead to something different. But I had already reached that point, and I knew it would not. The hardest part was not their disagreement. It was their certainty, because certainty is convincing. It is strong. It is difficult to stand against, especially when it comes from people you trust. But clarity is stronger, not louder, not more forceful, but more stable, because it does not depend on approval. It depends on truth. And I could no longer deny what I knew. So I continued, not aggressively, not defensively, but steadily, decision by decision, action by action. There were moments of doubt. Of course there were. Change does not remove uncertainty. It introduces it. And there were times when I questioned myself, not because I believed I was wrong, but because I understood the cost of being right too late. Because if I failed, the consequences would not fall only on me. They would affect thousands. And that weight does not disappear, even when your direction changes. But every time doubt appeared, so did something else. A memory, not of the attack, not of the loss, but of what I had seen, of what I had understood, of the cycle and where it leads. And that brought me back, not to confidence, but to commitment, because confidence can be shaken. Commitment is different. It does not require certainty, only decision. The criticism did not stop. It evolved. Some began to question my leadership. Others began to distance themselves. A few waited, watching to see what would happen. Because people do not follow change immediately. They observe it. They test it. They wait to see if it fails. And I accepted that because I had done the same thing before I changed. I had questioned. I had resisted. I had believed that force was the only way. And now I was asking others to see something different. That takes time, more time than most are willing to give. But time was exactly what this path required. Not immediate success, not quick results, but gradual change, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that builds quietly, until one day it becomes visible. I did not know how long it would take. I did not know what it would look like. I only knew one thing. I could not go back. Not after everything I had seen. Not after everything I had understood. Not after everything I had lost. Because returning would not just be a decision, it would be a denial. And I was no longer willing to deny the truth. If you are still listening, then you understand this. The moment you choose a different path, you must be prepared to walk it alone, at least at the beginning. Change does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a clear moment where everything shifts and the world suddenly understands. It moves quietly, slowly, often unnoticed at first. And for a long time, that is exactly how it was. After those decisions in June, nothing dramatic happened. There was no sudden peace, no immediate transformation, no moment where people turned and said, "This is working," because that is not how real change behaves. It tests you. It waits. It reveals itself only over time. In the first months, the tension remained. In some areas, conflict did not stop. In others, it seemed to hesitate, as if unsure how to respond to something different. That is something I had not expected. When you break a pattern, even slightly, everything around it begins to adjust. Not instantly, but inevitably. And what I began to see was not an end to conflict, but a shift in its rhythm. The intensity reduced in certain places, not everywhere, not completely, but enough to notice. Enough to ask a question I had not been able to ask before. What if this is the beginning, not the end? In 3 key regions, areas that had known constant instability, something changed. Not dramatically, but measurably. Fewer attacks, less retaliation, more space. Space for something that had not existed before. Breathing room. That may not sound significant, but for people who live in conflict, space is everything. It is the difference between constant fear and the possibility of something else. I visited one of those areas months later, not for a public appearance, not for visibility, but to see, to understand, because reports can only tell you so much. Reality must be witnessed. I saw children playing, not cautiously, not watching every movement around them, but freely. And that is something I had not seen in a long time. Because children adapt quickly. If they grow up in fear, they carry it naturally. If they grow up in peace, they trust it. And what I saw was something in between. Not complete safety, but enough for them to forget fear, even if only for a moment. That moment is where everything begins. I spoke to a woman there. She did not know me as a president. She knew me as someone who had influence. That was enough. She told me something simple. For the first time in years, we slept without listening for gunshots. Not every night, not perfectly, but sometimes, and those sometimes, they matter. More than people realize, because change does not arrive all at once. It builds through moments that seem small, until you understand what came before them. But it was not all progress. There were setbacks, moments where violence returned, moments where the old patterns tried to reassert themselves, because cycles do not break easily. They resist, they persist, they test whether you are truly willing to move in a different direction. And there were times when it would have been easier to go back, to respond with force, to return to what I knew, to satisfy the expectation that leadership means immediate reaction. But each time, I remembered not just what I had seen, but what I had felt, the emptiness, the absence of meaning, even after achieving everything I thought I needed. And that was enough to keep me moving forward, not confidently, not perfectly, but consistently. Over 2 years, the change became clearer, not absolute, not complete, but real. 3 regions, 3 areas where conflict did not disappear, but reduced, where cycles did not end, but slowed. And that slowing created something that had not existed before. Possibility. Possibility for dialogue. Possibility for rebuilding. Possibility for people to live, not just survive. I remained president. That did not change. But the way I understood that role. Before, I believed leadership meant controlling outcomes. Now, I understood something different. Leadership is not about controlling everything. It is about choosing direction. And accepting that direction requires time, patience, and resilience. I did not win the world. I did not solve everything. I did not end conflict. That is not what happened. What happened was smaller, but more important. I began to change. And through that change, something else began to shift. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to prove something I had not believed before. That strength is not defined by how much force you can apply, but by how much change you are willing to sustain, even when it is slow, even when it is questioned, even when it is not immediately understood, and perhaps most importantly, even when no one is watching. Because real change does not need an audience. It only needs commitment. I still carry what I lost. That does not disappear. It does not fade. It becomes part of you, but it no longer controls me. It no longer decides what I do next. And that is something I never thought possible. If you are still listening, then you understand this. You do not need to conquer the world to change it. Sometimes, you only need to stop repeating what is breaking it. There is a reason I have told you this story. Not because it is easy, not because it makes me look strong, and certainly not because it is complete. I'm still living it, still learning from it, still facing the consequences of who I was and the responsibility of who I am becoming. I did not begin this journey as a man of peace. I began it as a man of control, a man who believed that strength meant force, that leadership meant dominance, that change could be imposed if you were willing to push hard enough. And for a time, that belief worked, or at least it appeared to, because force can create results. It can move people. It can produce outcomes. But what it cannot do is heal what has been broken. What it cannot do is stop the cycle once it has been set in motion. What it cannot do is protect you from the moment when everything you built fails to save what matters most. That is the truth I learned, not through theory, not through advice, but through loss. Through a moment I would give anything to change, but cannot. And that is why I speak to you now, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has seen where one path leads and chose to step away from it. If you are listening to me, wherever you are in the world, you may not lead a nation, you may not command armies, you may not face decisions that affect thousands, but you face something just as important, a choice, every day, in ways that may seem small, but are not. Because the same pattern that shapes nations exists in individuals. Hurt becomes anger. Anger becomes reaction. Reaction becomes consequence. And consequence creates more hurt. It is the same cycle, whether it happens in a home or across borders. And the question is always the same. Will you continue it, or will you stop? I know what it feels like to continue. It feels powerful. It feels justified. It feels like you are doing something that matters. But I also know where it leads, because I walked that path completely. And when I reached the end of it, There was nothing there. No peace, no closure, no meaning that could replace what had been lost. Only emptiness, and a truth I could no longer ignore. That continuing would only create more of the same. More loss, more regret, more moments that cannot be undone. So I chose something different, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And I will not pretend that it solved everything. It did not. It does not. There are still challenges, still setbacks, still moments where the old way feels easier. But now, I understand something I did not understand before. Peace is not a destination. It is a direction you choose again and again, especially when it is difficult, especially when it is misunderstood, especially when no one else around you is choosing it, because that is where it begins. Not in agreement, not in consensus, but in decision. You may be wondering, why tell this story to you? Why share something so personal, so difficult, so unresolved? Because stories are not only about the person who lived them, they are about the person who hears them and what they choose to do next. I cannot change what happened to me. I cannot undo the moment that took everything from me. But if what I have learned, what I have seen, what I have experienced, we can stop even one person from continuing a cycle that leads to loss, then this story has meaning. Not because of me, but because of what it prevents. I do not ask you to believe everything I have said. Belief is personal. It cannot be forced. But I will ask you one thing, a question that I had to face when I stood between what I was and what I could become. If you lost everything, if you saw clearly where your path was leading, if you understood the cost before it was paid, would you still continue? Or would you choose something different before it is too late? That is the question, not for leaders, not for nations, but for every person who hears this, because the world does not change all at once. It changes, one decision at a time, one person at a time, one moment where someone chooses to stop instead of continue. And perhaps that moment is now. For you, for someone you know, for someone who will never hear this, but will feel the result of your choice. I stand here today, not as the man I was, but not yet as the man I hope to become. I stand in between, learning, failing, trying again, and that is enough. Because change does not require perfection. It only requires honesty and the willingness to move forward, even when the path is not clear. Before I leave you with your thoughts, I will say this, not once, but in a way that you will remember. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and what I have shared with you comes from truth I have lived. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words are not theory, they are the reality I carry. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and this story is not for sympathy but for understanding. If something in this stayed with you, if even one part made you pause, then do not let it end here. Carry it, think about it, and if you feel it is worth sharing, then let it reach someone else who may need to hear it. Not because it is perfect, but because it is real, and sometimes that is enough.